We have a very special guest with us today. We're talking Thanksgiving, and who better to talk about Thanksgiving than my dear friend, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Historian at Plimoth Patuxet Museum in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We are joined by Richard Pickering.
Good morning, counselors.
Hello. Yeah, welcome.
How you doing, Richard?
I'm in the middle of the Thanksgiving marathon. I typically spend the month of November sitting in front of a microphone or a camera or doing talks to Mayflower Society. So yesterday, I did a simultaneous Zoom with California, Oregon, and Washington Mayflower Societies,
Really?
who are not yet meeting together live. So they decided, let's all coordinate our meetings. And I lectured to them for 40 minutes yesterday. So typically November's pre-pandemic, I was all over the country, just going from lineage society to lineage society, talking to descendants about their history.
Right, because every single state has their own chapter or own collective group of descendants, correct?
They do. And you're being in Orlando, Florida has one of the largest gatherings of Mayflower descendants, and the other is California. Last night I learned in the state of California, there are 2,700 members.
Wow. That's crazy. That's a lot of descendants.
It is a lot of descendants.
And, when talking to these people, I'm sure they're passionate about their family and their history and the story of the Mayflower and everything. When they ask you questions, what are they passionate about? What kind of questions do they ask when they talk to you as historian that you are?
The movement right now on the part of descendants, and it's recent, is to understand the history as well as to say, oh, I'm descended from John Alden or John Howland, that there has been a shift to trying to understand the lives of the men and women in the 1600s, and that's very refreshing.
Yeah.
There's also an openness to understanding the complexities of the story, moving the Pilgrims from being people who are just representations of virtue to men and women who struggled and did good deeds and did deeds that were disappointing. So it's
the good and the bad.
Right.
Yeah. And can you tell me more, and our campers listening, what you do at Plimoth Patuxet, and what does the museum serve for the community? When you visit the museum, what is there to see and do, and what is it like on a daily basis there?
Yeah, I've been with the museum for 37 years now. Standing in front of the audience last night and talking about all of the different film projects I've worked on, I realized, wow, 37 years. And watching the museum serve millions and millions of people over that time. One of the big historic sites we have is Mayflower 2, a full-scale reproduction of the ship that brought the Pilgrims in 1620. Right. And other day I was doing a story with NBC News and realizing, when I told a reporter, since 1957, it's estimated that ship has been visited by 25 to 26 million people, realizing the impact of the museum's work in telling one of our founding stories and folding into that founding story the importance of the indigenous voices and recognizing that it's not just an English story and it's not just an indigenous story. It is these different communities reaching towards one another, sometimes collaborating and sometimes reaching towards one another in conflict.
Yeah. And do you find that working at Plimoth Patuxet, do you find it's a gratifying experience to share that story with so many people who might not know the whole picture?
It is. And I was with a lady from Texas who I'd never met before, and I had been asked to give her a private tour. And as she was leaving the museum, this complete stranger reaches over and takes me by the hand. And she says, "Isn't it wonderful that you found where you're supposed to be?" And realizing that when I leave home to go to work, I'm actually going to the other home. because the story that we tell is so important. And in particular, right now, the controversies related to Thanksgiving are taking what should be the most loving and rejoicing holiday of the year and in turning it into something very dark. And much of it is based on misinformation.
Right.
So looking back at the original event in 1621, when I was young, when I was your age, and I had a mentor by the name of Nana Pashamet, who was a great Wampanoag historian, Nani said, Richard, we need to uncouple the first Thanksgiving from King Philip's War. And for the campers who may not know about King Philip's War, it lasted in southern New England from 1675 to 1676, and for a few more years in northern and eastern New England. And it is considered the most violent war in American history when placed in comparison with the Revolution, with the Civil War, with the World Wars.
Yeah.
In the percentage of lives lost and property damage, King Philip's War is worst.
Right.
And Nana Pashamet used to say, in this easy leap from the first Thanksgiving in 1621 to the horrors of 1675, what gets lost is the mastery of the Pokanoket sachem Usamequin, who for years was shaping all of the English experience of Plymouth and other indigenous communities. He is shaping their interactions with all of these other communities. And he is the one who is in ultimate power. And Nana Pashamet used to say, Richard, if it had not been in Usamequin's interest, in Massasoit's interest, that the English live, he could have left them alone.
Yep.
And they would not have made it. But somehow, with the shifting power base in New England after an epidemic that destroyed up to 70 or 90% of coastal New England's native population, he now was reduced in strength.
Right.
And by reaching out to the English, he was getting access to war technology, access to European goods. And by being the first, that made him preeminent within the region.
Right.
So what we need to do is step back from the current mode of telling the story and return the agency to Native people and give young Indigenous people this example of leadership that was protective and self-sacrificing and very subtle, and that was hard work. That the piece of the early years of the English presence in New England was based on very hard work and daily interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic of misinformation, when you think about Thanksgiving specifically, what types of misinformation is there with that specific event in 1621 where people have misconceptions of what actually happened?
Within recent years, because writers are producing op-ed pieces and they are not doing deep research and they're just reading other op-ed pieces, they have no idea that they are reproducing the errors of others. And one of the sources of misinformation is a document that had been altered by a writer years ago.
Yeah.
That was related to the Pequot War of 1636 and 37, which Plymouth Colony did not participate in that war. That was a Mass Bay colony war. But a writer who was uninformed, she was not a historian, she used a document that had been altered in which the description of King Philip's War says Governor William Bradford, Plymouth Colony, when the original document was Governor John Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay Colony. But in this reliance only on an internet trail of research, that altered document has become the source of contention that, wow, they invited Native people to dinner in 1621 and then killed them 16 years later. And what we all need to do is become more sophisticated about understanding the distinction between New England's many indigenous tribes but also the distinction between New England's colonies, which just because they were English, they were not of like mind, and they had differing objectives, both in religion and economics, that kept them apart.
Right.
And one of the reasons that Plymouth did not participate in the Pequot War was that Massachusetts had overstepped its legal bounds 3 years earlier and had taken over some of Plymouth's legal authority in Maine. And so their refusal to enter that war was punishment for Massachusetts' arrogance.
Yep. Wow. And so much of this, so much of the early years of the settlers, you think about these different events happened, but it was amongst different tribes in different parts of Massachusetts, and all were not the same, right?
Yeah. And Nana Pashmet used to say to me, Richard, I want you to imagine those 3 days in 1621 and the people that were there. So you have 52 men, women, and children that survive the Pilgrims' first winter. Half of those 52 are under 18 years old. So think of the fragility.
Right.
When Nana Pashmet was alive, the imagining of the Pokanoket presence was, as Edward Winslow tells us, their greatest king, Massasoit, and 90 native men. So at that point, you have, for every adult English male, you've got 4 Pokanoket adult males. But more recent research and the archaeology is showing us that Edward Winslow, when we back out further into the letter, he says, many Indians coming amongst us, comma, amongst others, their greatest king, Massasoit, and 90 native men. The archaeology is showing us that there is a presence on the other side of the town brook that first year.
Mm-hmm.
And the first time that Massasoit talks to Governor Carver, he comes back either that night or the following morning, and he says, oh, our wives and our women are in the woods nearby, and we'll be back in 8 or 9 days to plant on the other side of the brook. So that means in the first year, you have households that the sachem has sent to Patuxet to plant near the English. So now at the first Thanksgiving, you can imagine the women and the children in the households just coming over that 12-foot brook.
Yep.
And they're there for it as well. Now, we're looking more and more at an event that happened in Plymouth on September 13th, 1621, reported by Nathaniel Morton, William Bradford's nephew, and also referred to in a vague way by Edward Winslow in his letter, that on that day, September 13th, 1621, there were 7 sachems at Plymouth. 2 other sachems had sent their ambassadors, and they entered into the same alliance as Massasoit had entered into in March.
Okay.
So when Edward Winslow says many Indians coming amongst us, could it be that only a few weeks later, those other sachemships are returning to continue the diplomatic relationship they've just started in the middle of September? So any attempt to make this event look aggressive on the part of the English is completely false, and unfortunately projects more our present condition as Americans who are distrustful of each other,
Yep.
who objectify someone who does not have their opinion, than 17th century reality.
Yeah. Where you really can't deny the facts and the sources, right, of what was written about the event.
Exactly. And what I would say our challenge as Americans, in the course of the Smithsonian documentary, they talk about how in the early 20th century, after many Americans felt the West had been closed and that tribal nations had been destroyed or either reduced in number and power, that they were no longer dangerous, that suddenly this shining moment of the feast of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag becomes this tranquilizer or sedative, saying we're now back to this again. I think as 21st century Americans, we need to look at the very same moment in a different way and not use it as a tranquilizer and a sedative, but use it as a challenge and look at the community building skills, at the diplomatic skills, at the realpolitik, that let's not romanticize this and turn these people at this point in their relationship into friends, but recognize they saw in the other skills that were needed or technologies that were needed to stabilize their own people. It's a level of sophistication that I think we find it hard to imagine. And it's a willingness to listen that I think we are also losing.
Yeah, it's so important to really focus on the whole story, like you said, and know what the facts are, and push for others to also agree to learn about what the holiday is about. You know, we all think about Thanksgiving and the original Thanksgiving and the story of the native people with the Pilgrims, and I feel like there's a lot of misinformation, on how Pilgrims dressed or what the interactions were like. And one question I had is when people visit the museum, what do they experience? What year are they visiting when they go to Plimoth Patuxet? And what do you guys project as a story?
The historic sites, when a guest arrives at the visitor center, there is a film that introduces them to the basics of 17th century history. And from the visitor center preparation, they then proceed to the Patuxet home site, which recreates the seasonal lives of the Pokanoket Patuxet people, that we wanted the guests to understand what it looked like in the spring and in the summer and in the winter. So there's seasonal houses and demonstrations going on. And there we explore the 12,000 years of history of Patuxet people on that particular patch of ground, that the museum is founded on Patuxet, which is the native word for the land that is currently called Plymouth.
Right.
That is a modern presentation of history where native staff and non-native staff in modern clothes are telling the story of the people for 12,000 years, and then focusing on the 17th century and the 300 years that follow. So the guest is always aware that Wampanoag communities are still here. From the historic Patuxet home site, they then go up to the craft center where they are able to talk with potters. We have an apothecary exhibit to study medicine of the period. And from there, they then enter the historic reconstruction of Plymouth as it appeared in 1627, so 7 years after Mayflower landed. And the presentation there is a combination of historical performers portraying men and women alive in 1627. There are no composite characters. Every person the guest encounters actually walked the face of the earth. Then there are also modern guest experience associates who are helping people negotiate this very different mental and spiritual and agricultural world. Because oftentimes they're feeling like, I'm a little thrown in over my head in this very odd world, and they just need a translator across the 4 centuries. But this month, November of 2021, we are experimenting, and we have pushed the year back 6 years to November 1621.
Oh, really?
So for the first 2 weeks of this month, we were recreating the arrival of the Fortune, the second ship to the colony. And then starting this week, people will be entering, and there'll be 2 large signs that say, you are now entering the autumn of 1621, since November is a little late to be representing a 17th century Thanksgiving. But so many guests come from around the world and they want to be there at Thanksgiving, that what we are now saying is, for the week of Thanksgiving, it is generic autumn 1621, but what they are entering is the day before the preparation for the coming of Sachem Massasoit.
Wow.
So they'll be entering this village where the few people that have survived the first winter are all preparing for that special manner of rejoicing that Governor Bradford had declared. And every day will reset. The next day will always be that day of preparation. But we think the guests are going to love being immersed in that moment.
That's amazing.
We had to choose that moment because we just don't have a staff large enough to have Sachem Massasoit come with 90 Native men. But people can talk about their excitement of what is about to come.
Right.
And Matt, you lived that life yourself as a historical role player. The questions that arise when you're attempting to recreate a moment, pushing things back to November 1621. I've been in the village every day. I said to the staff, as long as you're experimenting, I will try to walk through once or twice a day and just give me the high sign that you need questions answered. And for them, in the proximity to the first harvest, Lily, who's playing Priscilla Alden, the other day, she took me aside and she said, Richard, is this my first taste of corn? And she was thinking through, she'd never seen maize before in her life. She's looking over at the native families planting on the other side of Town Brook and watching their process. They're listening to what Tisquantum is saying. But she said, Richard, is this my first taste now that it's in and dried? Or might I ever have had the taste of this corn when it was green in summer? Or would we have been so insecure we wouldn't have eaten green corn? We wanted everything to get through the winter. So all of these questions are arising that are just fascinating when you put a historian in a new setting and he or she has to come up with, what are the realities I'm living with in this moment?
I think that was one of my favorite parts when I worked at Plimoth Patuxet in 2014 was realizing that I'm portraying a real person with a real life and real feelings that would be reflective of the environment he's in. And you think about, you're not from the New World, and you came over on the Mayflower or the Fortune, like you mentioned. What kind of experience was that like? You think about, you try to get in the head of the real person, right? And read their backstory and their history with their family. I just thought it was an amazing experience to be part of that.